When you write an iOS app, it needs to run on many different devices. IOS9 works on the iPhone 4S, on the 5, the 6 and 6S, both the regular and the large Plus version, and I'm not even getting to the iPads here. Different physical screen sizes and resolutions, but more importantly, they don't have the same layout, just scaled larger or smaller. The aspect ratio of height to width is different, and beyond that, an app can be asked to switch from portrait to landscape. Now, we don't want to have to create a different pixel-perfect user interface for each specific device. We need a UI that can automatically adjust itself for multiple devices and orientations. An auto layout is something that will help us do that, and it's already on. We just need to know how to start using it. Now, if you've ever wondered why the default scenes on a storyboard are square, well, it's to keep us conscious that we shouldn't be trying to build a UI just for one particular device or orientation, but make one that will look good everywhere. But Simon, I hear you say, this square layout doesn't seem to help very much because it seems to look bad everywhere. Well, true, until we start doing auto layout, it will look bad, and that's actually okay. Over in Xcode, I have a demo project. There's no code in this project yet, just multiple controls that I've dragged and dropped from the object library onto this scene. I've done nothing with auto layout yet. So we have a couple of buttons on the left and the right, a label in the center. Down at the bottom of this scene, I have a toolbar, a few other things like segmented controls and switches, just to see how this is going to change and affect when we run it and when we start to add auto layout. Now, if I go ahead and run this, in portrait mode, the issue is we're going to lose most of the content on the right, because this is just going to format itself the way that we've laid this out on the square, so we're losing all this right content. Similarly, if I switch to landscape mode, we're going to lose the content that's on the bottom right now. We're not seeing any of it. Now, we've not put anything inside a scroll view, so none of this is usable. We've got a bunch of wasted space on the right-hand side here. Now, auto layout is one of the things that can help us fix this. It is turned on. It's just that auto layout won't do anything until we provide a few simple rules about how we want this user interface to respond to a change in size. And we provide those rules by creating what are called constraints. Constraints in auto layout describe a relationship between two pieces of our user interface, two view objects. Now, importantly, it's not just a relationship between, say, a button and a label. In fact, the most important constraints are the ones we create between a control and its container view. So, for example, I could drag a button onto the square storyboard layout and then say that I want the left edge of the button, its leading edge. That should always stay this distance from the left side of the container, so I set up a constraint there. And that I always want the top of the button to stay this distance from the top of the container, so I'll add a constraint there. And by providing those two constraints to the top and the left when we're looking at it in the square storyboard view, then this button will always orient itself to the top and left. So if we run it in portrait, it stays there, oriented to the top and left. If we switch to landscape, it's still where we want it. But, on the other hand, let's say I add a toolbar to my square scene, and I want it at the bottom, and I want it to always fill the available width. Well, I can't just create the same kind of constraint, because if I do constrain it to the left and to the top, then when we view this in portrait, well, it's going to be halfway up the screen, and I'll lose a bunch of it on the right-hand side. And switching to landscape mode, I'll lose the entire toolbar because it's pushed too far off the bottom. Because with something like this, I don't want constraints to the left and the top. I want constraints to lock it to the bottom of the container view and to lock its left and right edges, its leading edge and its trailing edge to the left and right edges of the container. And if I set up those constraints, it would always stay on the bottom. And because there are constraints on the left and the right, then when we view it in portrait mode, the toolbar will be compressed to fill the available space there. And then when we view it in landscape mode, the toolbar will be expanded and made wider to fill the available space there. Now, we will often begin by setting up the main constraints between our controls and their containers, but you will also create constraints between two controls within a scene, like two labels or two buttons, or perhaps an image control and a toolbar. Because a constraint can keep elements together, or a constraint can keep them apart. It can even do both. So for example, we could have this image view always a certain distance from the edges, but we want to keep the bottom of this image close to the toolbar, just never allow them to overlap or to touch. So all of these constraints can be visually added and edited right in the storyboard in Xcode. And it's how we describe these adaptive smart arrangements without having to worry about exact resolutions for pixel positioning on any particular device. So let's do some. When you make a new Xcode project, auto layout is already turned on for your storyboards. It's a setting on the storyboard file itself. If you look at the first inspector with main.storyboard selected, you'll find a checkbox here for Use Auto Layout, as well as one for Use Size Classes, which we'll see a little later. But if you don't add your own constraints, Xcode will add them for you at runtime. Unfortunately, what Xcode will add is as if you'd added constraints to orient everything with a fixed position to the top left. That's why if you just leave it as is, everything pretty much scales as if it's to the top left. You'll just get huge, massive amounts of missing space on the right-hand side. So I'm going to begin with the button on the right-hand side of the storyboard. So when it runs in portrait, I'll lose it. If we switch to landscape, I can see it, but it's still leaving too much white space there. There's wasted space on the right-hand side. So I'd like that right-hand button to base itself not on the top left corner, but on the top right corner. And the main way to add constraints is with control drag. We've already seen that we can control drag from our interface into a code file when we're using assistant mode, but we can also control drag within the storyboard to create these constraints between our view objects. So on the right button, hit control and drag towards the edge. What'll happen is, as you see me kind of mouse off the boundaries of the button, it's highlighting the fact that I'm creating a connection between the button and the container view. I let go. It's asking me what kind of constraint that I want to do. Am I trying to center this vertically? No, I'm not. I'm going from the trailing space to container margin. So I'll choose that. And we get our first manual constraint. This is an actual constraint object. It's actually visible and I can select it if I'm careful in the storyboard. I can also see it in the document outline here. Now this constraint is showing up with red lines. We don't want that. As you can assume anywhere, red is not a good color. Constraints that show up in red mean something's wrong or something's missing. We want our constraints to show up in blue because when our constraints are in blue, that means they make sense to Xcode. Now, when we're doing auto layout work, we will see plenty of red constraints as we arrange and rearrange and edit things. But they do need to be fixed. It is a warning in Xcode. I'll see the symbol turning up in the center section here, the little exclamation mark, although the best place to diagnose these, if you don't understand why they're showing up incorrectly, is to open up the document outline. And at the top of it, you'll see this little kind of quite small and cryptic sign. But if I click that, it's going to take me to a missing constraints section saying it doesn't understand where the Y position is meant to be for this right button. The issue is that as I'm adding constraints for individual controls like this right button, where I'm telling Xcode I'm taking charge of this now, it now knows where the right button is meant to move across to the right, but it doesn't know where it's supposed to be positioned vertically. So I need to add one more constraint. I'll control drag from the button up towards the top, making sure that I see the container view, the larger view here highlighted, and let go. Now it's asking what do I want to do? Do I want to center this horizontally? No. Am I interested in a constraint for vertical spacing to the top layout guide? Well, yes, I am, and click that. We have two constraints, and notice they are now showing up in blue. I see the phrases top layout guide and bottom layout guide a lot when we're working with constraints, and these are lifesavers when we're doing auto layout work, because the top and the bottom edges of a screen can be a bit of a moving target. We don't usually want the actual top or bottom of the screen because we have things like the status bar or a navigation bar or a toolbar or a tab bar at the bottom. So the top layout guide and bottom layout guide represent the practical edges of our available space. And they change if you have a status bar or a navigation bar or a toolbar. Over here in my document outline, I see no auto layout issues. At the top of it, I can go back to the regular view here of our document outline and all the elements inside it. Now, one thing that's worth pointing out is that we've gone blue. Everything's okay about the auto layout constraints on this button. And it's important to realize we can add auto layout constraints to our storyboard one by one, working on one control at a time. That wherever we haven't added our own, Xcode will generate the automatic, very basic fixed constraints. So let's go ahead and run this and see what difference it makes. Well, in portrait mode, I can see that this is actually appearing over here. I do have the button. It's in the right position. It's a bit obscured by the fact that my centered title is by no means centered. Now notice that in landscape mode, it's kind of moved up a little bit. That's because the typical showing of landscape mode now doesn't use the status bar in order to give more space. So this is tying itself to the correct location at the top of the screen or the top of the available space. So let's take this a little bit further. I'm going to take the title here, Control drag to the top, let go. It's asking me two questions. Do I want to center this horizontally in the container, or am I interested in doing a constraint for the vertical spacing, the gap between it and the top layout guide? Well, actually, I'm interested in both, but I'll take the center horizontally first. It adds this constraint first, shows up in red because only one is not good enough. So I will do another control click back up to the top. I see the dot beside this saying it is now centering horizontally in container. I also want the vertical spacing. If I do that, we're going blue. It looks good. Let's try and run this again. And this looks more like what we're after here. We've got a center title, a left button, and a right button. Well, let's do something at the bottom. I'm going to use the toolbar here. Things like toolbars can be a bit tricky because sometimes they're difficult to grab. The toolbar itself includes other items like this flexible space in the middle, the left bar item, the right bar item. So I want to be careful when I'm setting up constraints that I'm dragging from the right thing. So I can control drag. I'll click the toolbar, drag towards the left-hand side, and it's becoming a little bit tricky. I can't drag exactly onto the edge because there's a bit of an overlap between the toolbar and the container view. One of the techniques you can do is actually drag into the document outline. So instead of dragging to the visible part here, I say I want to link this to the view. I let go. It's going to ask, what constraint do I want? Well, really, it's the left edge or the leading edge to the container margin. So the side of the container. So I'll select that one, showing up in red. I'll do it again from the toolbar, and I can drag from the toolbar on the storyboard, or I can drag from the toolbar in the document outline. Control drag up to the view, let go. Now we want trailing space to container margin. And finally, I want to do one more, which is tying this toolbar to the bottom. So control drag from the toolbar to the view, vertical spacing to bottom layout guide. Command R, and I can see that I do have the toolbar showing up at the bottom here. This is in portrait mode. I can see that it's squeezing in from the right hand side, so I can see both the right bar item and the left bar item. If I switch to landscape, it should move up, and it does indeed, so we have the toolbar showing up there as well. But as you can see, constraints can get a little tricky to add, and until you've done a lot of them, it's also very easy to accidentally add a constraint to the wrong thing, tying the wrong things together. So it's just as important to know how to delete them. But as you can see, constraints can get a little tricky to add, and until you've done a lot of them, it's also very easy to accidentally add a constraint to the wrong thing, tying the wrong things together. So it's just as important to know how to delete them. And when you have added manual constraints to a control, then when you select that control, Xcode will show you the constraints you've added to just this. So if I select the right button, on the side here is the constraint I added to the margin of the container, and at the top, very small but just grabbable, is the constraint that I added to the top layout guide. Now sometimes these things are very difficult to grab in the storyboard view, so you can get them from the document outline as well. There is a section here called constraints with all of them in there. I can see I've got the right button top constraint here, and when I click it in the document outline, it highlights over here. These constraints are objects, and when you select one, you'll also find the ability to change the properties of it. You go to the attributes inspector, it's telling me it's a vertical space constraint, and there's lots of information about how much this is. So things can be edited. I can also delete it. I can grab a particular constraint either here in the storyboard view or in the document outline part of it, hit the delete key, we get rid of that constraint. However, when I select that button, it's now back to being red again, so I need to add that one back. Well, here's another way we could do that. I can select a control and come down to this lower menu here, the one that says pin when I mouse over, and it's a way of adding new constraints. Now I know right now that I have a constraint on the right hand edge. I don't want one on the left. I don't want one on the bottom. I just want one between it and the top. So I'm going to select the very faint red dotted line here, and it's going to tell me it'll add a constraint of 8 points between this and the top layout guide. And then I'll just click the button at the bottom saying add one constraint, and it's going to add the same thing that I would have done with control drag. This can be a very useful way to add several at a time. I'm actually going to set up some constraints on the left button as well, because even though this works quite well in portrait mode, what's going to happen when we shift to landscape mode is it's going to look a little bit further down than the right button. So with the left button selected, pin menu, click the left and the top. Add two constraints. Now when we run this, it looks the same in portrait mode, but if I flick to landscape mode, it's now at the same level as the title and the right button. The icons at the bottom right of the storyboard are very useful for auto layout. The third one is the pin menu that allows you to add new constraints to any selected control that you have. And the fourth one here is the auto layout resolver. It gives you multiple options for trying to correct things if there's issues with your auto layout. Now this is very sensitive to what you have selected on the screen, or if you have anything at all selected. So let's say I select this label. What I'll find in this menu is there's some options here to clear the constraints. So I can delete all of them at once rather than grab one at a time. I can reset to suggested constraints, which can be very useful. There's even an option for doing that for all views in the view controller. This can be a very useful way to get started with auto layout, because it'll make its best guess at the constraints that it should apply based on how you've dragged your controls and where you've positioned them. If you find the icon at the bottom right a little bit fiddly to grab, you can find the same options under the editor menu. There's also the resolve auto layout issues there. But again, it's very sensitive to what you have selected. I'm going to just click on the label, go up to the editor menu, come down to the auto layout resolver, and hit reset to suggested constraints. And I'm doing this on the bottom section, which means add them for everything in this view controller. While it doesn't make a huge visible difference to the storyboard, if I looked at it right now, I have no idea if I had any constraints or not. If I expand the document outline, I'll see that in the constraints section, there's a lot of them have been added. Let's take a look and see what effect this had. Well, I shift into portrait mode, and this is looking pretty good. I've got everything visible here. I've got my switch on the bottom. I've got the toolbars. I've got the segmented control. The buttons have moved in from the right-hand side. So if I shift this to landscape, we're running into a slight issue here in that the switch is overlapping the segmented control. Maybe what I'll need to start doing is thinking, what do I actually want to have happen? Would I want this larger image view to shrink a little bit? Would I want to move things up? Would I want to compress them? Maybe I just want something to disappear. So it isn't going to fix every issue that you'll have just by automatically applying these auto layout constraints, but it can be a really good way to get started on them, and then you can start tweaking and making your own adjustments to them as you go. I'm testing this using the iPhone 6 simulator, and I might be curious of what would this look like on a 6 Plus? What would this look like on a 5S? Now, we've already seen we can use the drop down to switch into different simulators, but there is another way we can do it, which makes that question a lot easier to answer even when we're just editing our project. So we'll see that next. We've already seen that we can use the drop-down to run this on different simulated iOS devices. But that's a bit tedious if what you're wanting to do is see how does this look on an iPhone 5 versus an iPhone 6s Plus. You don't want to have to stop and restart different simulators all the time. And luckily there is a way to view the appearance of this user interface across different devices while you're editing it in Xcode. And it's another use of the Assistant Editor. Now, usually when we open the Assistant Editor in Xcode and we're on a storyboard, we're going to see its corresponding code file. Storyboard on the left, view controller on the right. And that's because of the behavior of the jump bar here. There's an option that says automatic. It'll automatically link you to viewcontroller.swift because that's usually what you want to see in assistant mode. But there is another choice. I can come down to preview. So again, it's changing that to preview. And what we get now is a quickly updating preview of how this is going to look based on the auto layout constraints that you've set up in the storyboard. In this case, how it's going to look on an iPhone 4-inch. At the bottom of this is telling you exactly what this is emulating. There's a plus button at the bottom left of this half of the editor. If I click that, I get an option for several more. We can see how this would look on an iPhone 6 Plus on the 5.5-inch display. That opens up, and this is looking pretty good on this one. We've got everything lined up. So yep, that's not a problem. Looks like we've got a bit of tweaking that we might have to do with the smaller devices, and we'd have to think about exactly what we'd want to happen. Would I want the font to be smaller? Would I want it to be truncated? Because we may legitimately run into the issue that we just can't fit everything on the same screen. So you can continue to add more. I could add an iPad or an iPhone 4.7-inch. We could take a look at that one. At the bottom of each of these is the option to shift it into landscape mode. So we can do that too and see how this will look. I'm getting a different kind of issue with the switch, but there's a few things we can tweak. As you make changes in the storyboard, you'll actually see those changes updated in the preview mode. So perhaps I'm interested in working on the centered title here. I'm going to select just that label, making sure that I can see the constraints around it. Come down to the Auto Layout Resolver and just clear the constraints for the label. I can immediately see the impact that it has over here. Still not looking good. Let's try something else here. I'm going to manually add them. Drag up to the top. I'd like to center that horizontally in the container. We're getting the red lines. I'm going to re-add that. Control drag. Vertical spacing to top layout guide. A little bit better, but it's pushing off the right button. And that's because when I'd used the Auto Layout Resolver to suggest some constraints, it had created a constraint between the label and the right button here. So now we're having a knock-on effect that there's issues with the right button itself. I'm going to set these up manually. Vertical spacing, that looks pretty good. And you know, over here, that's pretty close. It looks a lot better. So this is a common way that you want to do things. You'll use some of the suggested constraints from the auto layout menu, and then you'll start tweaking them, what's sometimes referred to as auto layout surgery, tweaking the tiny little parts of this to try and get things to line up well. But now it looks okay on a 4-inch. It looks pretty good on the 5.5-inch. It looks pretty good on the 4.7 one. We're going to have to start working with this switch, but I think that'll do for right now. Now, from the demos that I've gone through in the last few minutes, you can probably tell that auto layout is one of these areas that can get very deep, and you can spend a lot of time here. That's absolutely true. So while there's only so much I can cover here, I would like to point out a couple of external resources you'll find useful. One is the section on developer.apple.com for adaptive user interfaces. That'll link you to the full auto layout guide. There is a dedicated auto layout guide with a cookbook part to it. There's debugging auto layout sections, advanced auto layout sections. So there's a lot here. But back on that adaptive user interfaces, you will also find links to a couple of video presentations. At Apple's 2015 Worldwide Developer Conference, there were not one, but 2 sessions on the mysteries of auto layout. So the videos for this can be found at the WWDC videos on apple.com. Definitely a couple of things to keep in mind when you want to take this deeper. There are too many iOS devices and different aspect ratios. We need to be able to create smart user interfaces that can automatically adapt. And the key to this is auto layout. We don't need to spend our time obsessing about positioning elements at exact pixel locations. Instead, we set up constraints, rules that will describe a relationship between 2 view objects, often a view and its container. Auto layout is on by default, but unless you add your own constraints, it will just constrain everything to the top left. Now, these constraints are added directly in Xcode by control dragging between 2 elements or by using the menus at the bottom right, like the pin menu and the auto layout resolver menu. These constraints are objects. They can be selected, edited, and deleted within Xcode. Now, auto layout can certainly get tricky, and constraints can interfere with each other or just not give you the result you expected. So one thing that helps us here is using the preview mode of the Assistant Editor to see the immediate effects of changes on a storyboard across multiple devices and orientations without having to actually run the app. However, in iOS 9, there is a brand new control that will save us from a lot, not all, but a lot of the auto layout work we would otherwise need to do. That new control is called the stack view, and it's the first thing we're going to cover in the next module.